Hi there. This is Nathan Maharaj, producer and co-host, jumping in to let you know we're taking a tiny break this summer. While we're away, we're bringing you this episode recorded back in April for an event we had at our office called KoboCon. It's a 3-day event where my colleagues gather to present some of the most interesting stuff we're working on or are thinking about, and this year, we wanted to include a thought-provoking topic for a live recording of Kobo in Conversation. So we invited friend of the show and renowned debunker and explainer Timothy Caulfield to join us over Zoom for a chat about his latest book. So let's head now to the event space at Kobo's downtown Toronto office for Kobo in Conversation live at KoboCon.
My guest is Timothy Caulfield. He's the research director of the University of Alberta's Health Law Institute. He's the Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy. He is the welterweight champ of wellness industry debunking and the author of books including The Science of Celebrity and The Cure for Everything. Timothy Caulfield's new book is The Certainty Illusion, What You Don't Know and Why It Matters. Joining us live from unseasonably snowy Alberta, please join me in welcoming Timothy Caulfield.
I love the welterweight guesstimate. I'll take that as a compliment, an over-optimistic compliment.
I have to admit, I did, my Google search history does show Timothy Caulfield, how tall? Throughout your career, you've staked out an area of skeptical inquiry around health claims rooted in pseudoscience, and it's provided you no shortage of material. In fact, I think you could just carry on doing that. That would have, there's grist for that mill forever, unfortunately. But in this new book, you go a level deeper. You get into why we think we know what we know. Why take this wider view now?
Yeah, and this audience will know this very well. When you start writing a book, you don't know what the universe is going to look like when it's finished, right? And so my initial reason for wanting to do sort of the deeper dive on kind of the social and structural forces that got us to where we are was, selfish. I'm deeply fascinated by it, and it's actually an area where we've done a lot of research, or a lot of my academic research is on things like science hype, the incentives baked into our knowledge economy. That's the kind of stuff that I've been doing for a long time. And you often get this sense that our public discourse about those things is at the surface, as you said at the top, right? It's about the kind of the output, the misinformation, the disinformation, the twisted science, the lies that come from the wellness industry. And I kind of wanted to get, all that's a problem, but how did we get here, right? So, I think it's important because that's how we're going to solve this issue long term. It's a generational issue, and that's how we're gonna. But now the book comes out, and we're in this universe, right? This universe where everything I talk about in the book has been kind of hypercharged to the point where, it doesn't feel real, even for someone who studies this. It is the number one, let's use the graphics, right? The number one issue in the world today, and that's causing like immense problems, right? Absolutely immense problems. By this, I mean the spread of mis and disinformation. So kind of unpacking how we got here, and as you said off the top, why it influences us, I think is really, really important.
Well, one of the forces behind that influence is a term you call science-sploitation. It comes up a lot in this book, but could you explain what is it and how do we know when it's happening?
Yeah, and there are a lot of dimensions to this too, right? So science-sploitation, sort of the short answer is taking real science, real scientific terms, and exploiting them to sell bunk, to push agendas, to build brands, right? And it happens all of the time. In fact, I think it's become almost the norm. As I joke in the book, no one says, my product, my idea, my suggestions for solutions is evidence-free, less science. It has less science, right? No one says that, right? And I joke in the book that as a brand, the Enlightenment has won. right? So, people recognize that science gives legitimacy, science makes it feel true, if you use scientific terms.
Yeah.
Um, even if, people look around, what are you talking about? The Enlightenment one? We're in like a dark age 2.0. It's one as a brand, but not in substance, right? So what you see is, wellness influencers and leaders of countries, using sciencey terms to justify their positions. Like RFK Jr. does this all of the time. You see wellness influencers, throwing out microbiome, stem cell, precision, those kinds of terms. Quantum's my favorite.
Oh, once you start with the quantum, it's hard to stop.
Quantum. And even though there's no real science to back it up, but research tells us, unfortunately, this strategy works. It really does work. And I think one of the reasons it works is our information environment is so frenetic, right? It's so fast paced. We're just looking for cues of legitimacy, right? And, because we don't have the time to do a deep dive, into, I've been doing, as you highlighted at the beginning, I've been doing this for a long time. And early days, I first started debunking, alternative medicines and wellness strategies. A lot of those things were justified differently then. This is a different way of knowing. This is a different cultural perspective to, your health, which is actually a more almost interesting challenge and question than, but fast forward to now, that doesn't happen as much anymore, right? Now things are justified using science. You should be eating this because it's good for your microbiome, right? It's regenerative or something like that. People don't say so much, especially in this new longevity, tech bro wellness movement. People justify it on fake science, limited science, on science exploitation.
How does science exploitation have a ring to it? Is there a way we can be alert to the fact that it's happening?
Yeah, that's a great. So the bad news is, let's start with the bad news. It's getting more difficult, right? And by the way, we've actually studied this science exploitation phenomenon. We've done research in the context of the microbiome and stem cells and genomics, and it used to be easier because there would be no science to back it up, right? It would, by no science, no appearance of science. So the term would just be used almost like, it's like a celebrity endorsement. This skin cream brought to you by stem cells, and then there would be no real science to back it up. That still happens. You still see it happening. You see, bottled water, being, with, non-GMO and gluten-free, which is completely absurd. But what's happening now is it's easier to make fake science, right? So it's easier to make a study that looks real. And so even if people take the time, and they rarely do, to click through a claim, they may be met with a study that looks legitimate, but is actually, published in a predatory journal, or is not even a journal at all, but just has, the appearance of a journal. And, it's even asking a lot, I think, for the general public to go that far, to click through to actually find the study. And I think a lot of people would stop there and not realize that this is a fake study. Having said all that, the cliche is true. The cliche is true. If it sounds too good to be true, probably is. At a minimum, that should be a cue to look for other things.
You're saying there are no miracle cures that all doctors hate? Have I been clicking nonsense?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Start with the presumption that it's not true if it feels too good to be true. And then if it sounds hypey, in other words, like, oh my, new stem cell intervention, I promise, if there was a genuine stem cell breakthrough, a microbiome, you would know, you'd hear it from multiple sources, right? So even those two things can help. And the third thing is, always ask yourself, what kind of evidence is being used? Is this just an anecdote? Is there a body of evidence to support this? Don't fall for what's called the single study syndrome, right? Humans are complex. We live in a complex environment. Almost never is one study, even if it's done pretty well, gonna, overturn conventional wisdom, the scientific consensus on a topic.
Yeah, science moves slow, doesn't it? Its claims are pretty modest incrementally.
Yeah, Science is hard. It's hard. Science is messy. Science is contradictory. It's really so in the book. And look, as everyone knows, I'm a science geek. I love science. I've always been a science geek. I've had the opportunity throughout my career to work with, big science projects in the genomic space. Human Genome Project, in nanotechnology, neuroscience. Big interdisciplinary projects, and almost without exception, and this is going to sound like I'm being damning, and I don't mean it to sound that way. Billions of dollars spent. Almost none of the promises, we're talking from the 1990s till now, have been fulfilled. Right? None of them, right? And they were all promised as revolutionizing, genomics, stem cells, microbiome, I could go on, right? None of them have been fulfilled. That sounds damning, but it's more about how this research is being presented, because really exciting things have happened. They have happened, right? But that's not what was anticipated early days. And I think that's a lesson too. We don't know where great science is going to take us. Buckle up, enjoy the ride.
One really surprising insight that you offer up in The Certainty Illusion is that research has shown, real research, you cite several studies, so I'm not falling prey, you're not going to get me there. What you found was there are people who, if you have more education, you can find yourself more deeply entrenched in a position which you did not necessarily educate or reason yourself into. Can you speak about that correlation of deeper education and then be that kind of immovability or falling prey to certainty?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating phenomenon, and let's start with the big phenomenon that's not necessarily about deeper education. And this is the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So this is the idea that the more certain you feel about a topic, the less you actually know, right? And so. And this is a phenomenon that impacts all of us, right? It's a kind of one of our cognitive biases. We tend to have overconfidence on things, overconfidence on our knowledge on topics. And so there's nuance to it. So I'm going to oversimplify to agree here. But in general, the message is often the more people think they know about a topic, the less they do, right? And so there have been studies on GMOs, on vaccines, on climate change. So people with very strong positions often know the least about it, right? And again, it sounds like I'm being pejorative, but this happens to all of us a little bit. Mm-hmm. We're incapable of knowing how little we know about a topic. So that's sort of the broad phenomenon. But the other thing that can happen is that people that are very deep in a particular topic, it becomes who they are, right? And it can become difficult to change your mind on that topic, right? So one of the things in the book I recommend that we all do is try to really embrace scientific humility, right? This idea of scientific humility. And there's a lot of interesting research that suggests, and again, hard to study this well, so I have to be careful not to overstate what the data says. But, if you embrace that idea of scientific humility, you're less likely to fall for misinformation, more likely to follow the good evidence, right? Less likely to spread misinformation. And there's other benefits associated with embracing scientific humility, and the idea there is just recognizing, you said this already, science is hard, right? Your knowledge on a topic is likely limited. Be open to the evolution of science, and I think the majority of scientists do exactly that. Unfortunately, we often hear from those that are incredibly wedded in their position, and they kind of have an impact on public discourse because of that, right? The scientist that says, well, this is a really complicated topic, most of the evidence says this, but a lot of that evidence is correlational. There's a few small that's not a very sexy message, yeah. Versus the person that says, this is going to cure you. This is the magic cure that'll make you live forever. So there are also science communication challenges associated with that embrace of scientific humility. But just because it's hard doesn't mean we should do it. And I actually believe we can do both. We can embrace scientific uncertainty, humility, but still make the messages interesting, exciting, and worth hearing about. One more thing I recommend in the book is that we all make a list of things we've changed our mind on.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about this.
Yeah. Yeah, based on the evolution of science, right? Based on the evolution of science, and I have that list. And if you don't have that list, look at my chapter on narcissism, because everyone should be able to create that list.
Well, yeah, you talk about how healthy it is to, like, I think you literally say there's certainly healthy reasoning to keep track of how often you change your mind. And not even, I don't even think in the book that you narrow it down to principles of like natural science, but even, just positions to observe your mind changing, to observe how you're persuaded. Can you speak about why that's good for us? What do we benefit from watching ourselves change over time?
I really like that point that you just made there too, because I think it's when you say change your mind, it's like, oh, I was wrong before and now I think this, or that I thought this and that was wrong. And it's because that's still binary thinking, right? It really is about allowing your position to evolve, right? To evolve. And I think that's important, for some of the reasons I've highlighted, just this notion of scientific humility, allows you to keep an open mind. But the other thing is that I think it's respectful to critical thinking and our understanding of how knowledge is accumulated in this scientific era, right? It's open to the idea of scientific uncertainty and the idea that most decisions that humans make are made on the best available evidence. We don't have perfect evidence for everything. We make decisions based on the best available evidence that we have. And I think we all want to do that. I often joke, no one wants to walk across a bridge created by, contrary voices or contrary perspectives on physics and engineering, right? No one wants to fly on all knowledge is relative airline, right? We want to fly on the airlines that are using the best available evidence, recognizing that might those things might evolve. We've seen airplanes get better and better. We've seen bridges get better and better, and we need to respect that in other spaces. But it's weird because with health, often we completely reject that, right? We don't say, okay, you used to tell us this, now you tell us that, therefore you're evil, and you're part of the meta narrative coming from the World Economic Forum.
Yeah, we don't go for red pill infrastructure, do we? We're like,
no, we don't.
There should be more
well
granola.
Said. I'm going to steal that from you. Consider that stolen.
There you go. It's done. It's my gift.
Okay, there you go.
One of the things that you do really well in this book also is you outline incentive structures that drive people to believe certain things, or that make it certainly more comfortable to go one way versus going another. Not even in matters of belief alone, but also in pursuit of knowledge, that we should go find out more about this, and we're just going to leave this aside, which is its own kind of message and its own piece of it's information on its own. Can you talk about that? How those incentives shift us around? Which journal is publishing? Who's granting what?
Look, our entire world, increasingly so, I think, our entire information environment is now filled with incentives, and sometimes those incentives and nudges are invisible, right? We don't even see them. So I'll move away from sort of the corporate world and talk about it in the context of, let's just talk about publication, right? So in my world, in the academic world, still, even though we know this is problematic, we know even since I finished the book, there's been more studies highlighting how problematic this is. The incentive is quantity, number of papers that you're going to publish, right? That is the incentive. And of course, where you publish them is important. And also this promise of major breakthrough change, right? So that means the incentives that are baked into the academic world are for quantity over quality, right? That's what's baked in, and hype over more accurate and careful and nuanced descriptions of the research you're doing. And I'm not pointing my finger. I'm part of this world, and as I joke in the book, I think I've done it too. Those are the incentives that are baked in. But we all face those incentives, and we face them kind of day to day in our interaction with, say, social media, right? Social media, the incentives there are created to promote, as I often, rage, right? To promote rage and anger, right? Our whole world is now incentivized to create rage and anger. And there's a big study that came out late November, early December, published in Science, that talked about the degree to which misinformation, disinformation is shared on the back of rage. Why is that? Because the incentives on Twitter, on X, sorry, TikTok, Instagram, they feed the sharing of content based on emotion, right? Our emotional responses to things, because as I said earlier, our information environment is so frenetic, so fast paced, that's all we have time for. That's how we make our decisions, is based on. There was a study that came, again, I think December, that found that 74% of the content on social media is shared without clicking through. Think about that, right? And that just means that it's shared based on your emotional response to it. Does it play to your political ideology? Does it play to your rage, your grievances, right? That's what. Why that's a really important statistic is, that's what fills our information radar, right? People sharing stuff based on emotional response. And so that's a big incentive. And I think it's a lesson in the book, as you know, I talk about big topics, but I also talk about little topics, like everything from pet food to, because I think it's important to recognize these incentives happen, at work. They happen when you're in a boardroom, and they happen day to day when you're making decisions about what you're going to feed your cats and dogs, right? They're everywhere. They're in the nooks and crannies of our lives, and I think it's important to recognize that.
Well, I want to zero in on that, because you brought up emotions, and that was one of the more interesting points in the book as well. That as much as we talk about the rational process of deductive reasoning, behaving rationally, digging through the body of evidence, so much is powered by emotions. And you write about kind of that warning of, like, looking to our emotions to see, are we coming from a place of reason, or are we just kind of self-justifying? Do you have any advice on, like, the kinds of feelings we should be watching for, the kinds of behaviors we might be tipping towards that might clue us in that we're not really acting as reasonably as we might think?
Yeah, it is and I think it's increasingly so, right? That because our information environment, as I talk about in the book, we cannot process all the information that we're bombarded with per day, right? So of course, emotions are going to play a big, our initial response, our initial feelings is going to play, a big role. And part of that is, quick aside here, is because we live in echo chambers too, right? Because responding emotionally, responding intuitively drives us into echo chambers of individuals that have the same emotional responses to these topics that we do. And that, that's terrible for democracy, that's terrible for the truth. But that, the information platforms benefit from that, right? Because it creates clicks and traffic. So that's, again, a big incentive that's really shaping our world. But as I said, the research does show the information that plays to our rage, our grievances, our fears. I wrote a piece for the Toronto Star that came out in January, where I argued we're in a fear-demic now, right? Because if it plays to our fears, we're more likely to believe it and to respond to it, right? And to share the misinformation. And again, I know people are sick of this topic, but let's bring it up. If you just think about the U.S. election, the points that were used to get votes, immigration, crime, the economy, all based on fear, and often the claims were completely false, but it didn't matter because it played to that fear. The other thing that's happening here, and as someone who's followed this for a really long time, is the degree to which politics, and I won't, it happens across the political spectrum here. I want to be careful when I say that, but I can't believe the degree to which misinformation, even in the health space now, is just tethered to your economic position. In both Canada and the United States, more so in the United States, but this is true, especially in my province. Here, it's true here too. Whether you're vaccinated or not, right? Whether you're vaccinated, the strongest predictor is your political ideology. In the United States, listen to this stat. This is from Kaiser. In the United States, that is your political identity is more strongly correlated to whether you're vaccinated than race, religion, education, income, insurance coverage, age. It is the number one predictor. That's mind-blowing, right? That's absolutely mind-blowing. And of course, you have to be careful not to overinterpret that, because there's socioeconomics baked into who you voted for and your political identity. But still, I think it really highlights the degree to which a lot of misinformation, and this goes back to those echo chambers, now reside in these echo chambers that are it's part of your community. This is what my community believes. So what can we do? What can we do to push back against it? There's really interesting. So I asked a colleague of mine, Kate Starbird. She's a well-known misinformation researcher at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I said, what's your advice? And I thought she'd say, fact checking, go make sure you check multiple sources. No, she said, if it feels like this is playing to your emotions, if it feels like, I think her actual quote was, if it feels like your team just scored a touchdown, that should be a moment to pause, right? Wow. To check, because that means that content was designed for you and designed to make you feel a certain way. Veracity be damned, right? Yeah. And so that's a really good advice. And the other advice is this one. Pause. Right? Pause. The magic of the pause, right? So researchers like David Rand at MIT and Gordon Pennycook, who I've collaborated with at Cornell, formerly of University of Regina, they found that just pausing, even for a moment, can make a difference. And they call them accuracy nudges, right? So we're not talking about, a half hour. They're talking just pausing, taking that breath, right?
Literally just take the breath.
Yeah.
Shave a few beats per minute off your heart rate.
Exactly. Can when you see the headline, when you see the content, makes it look. It's not magical. But it really does make a difference. And I love that recommendation. And by the way, I keep a list of misinformation I've fallen for too. And I've fallen for stuff in the absolute cliche way. It played to my preconceived notions. It played to my confirmation bias. It played to my rage. It played to my expectation. Boom, I believed it. And you know what? I've even shared it. So here I am, a misinformation expert who studied this. I teach it. I teach it. And it's happened to me too. So I think that humility is also important to recognize.
Yeah. Physician, heal thyself.
Exactly.
There's a section where you talk about keywords and watchwords and jargon and buzzwords. In the book, it's health halo words, natural, organic, non-GMO, all the stuff. But what that reminded me of was in the tech sector, we kind of have a few of those ourselves. We've got agile. We're not allowed to. There's no project that's getting budget approval that's not AI somehow. It is astonishing and disappointing. More disappointing, I think, that we all fall for this. Why do we keep doing this? What's the advantage? Like, why is if we know I think we see in the rearview mirror every time when we fall in for a trend, and we think we're wiser than we were, but then we just pick up a new set of jargon. Well, what's the jargon for? Why do we keep doing this?
Yeah, I love that. So one of my kids is a software engineer for one of the big companies in the United States. I will not say which one. And she jokes about this all the time. Like we were just this weekend, we were having a laugh, having a cocktail and joking about this very thing, synergize, AI, platform, all of these things. And often there's no connection between the AI and the claimed benefit. Why? Why, right? They signal they're a shortcut. They're a shortcut to certainty, right? In the health space, they for sure play that role, right? They, again, not pointing fingers. because we do live in this really chaotic information environment, we all want to make the right choices for ourselves and for our companies, and for our communities. And so these are shortcut words that make it feel more certain than it really is. Like all those words that I have in the book that's the role they play. So if you're making a decision based on this word, you're more likely making the right, I call it the goodness illusion, right? They're making the right, I was going to call it decision illusion actually, but goodness illusion. And we do it also with politics, right? The word freedom, liberty, and, well, what does that have to do with what you're talking about? And for sure we do it in business, synergize, right? We do it with business too. And I just think it's become, we've always done it, but it's getting more common because our information environment is so frenetic, and we almost need those shortcuts now, these information shortcuts, just to get through the day. So there's this big push in my world, and I don't think we could do it in the tech world because of how fast-paced it is, but of this idea of slow science. We've got to slow down to avoid exactly that, right? And I think it's important to highlight, as I think we both already have, more often than not, the use of the word is not supported by the evidence, or at a minimum, it's way more nuanced than the use of that word suggests, right? Or the promise sort of embedded in that word when it's being used, especially in the marketing context. And as I said, we see it across the ideological spectrum. Put that word in your pitch, freedom, liberty, market forces, blah, blah, blah. It's used in the exact same way.
Do you have any advice for overcoming, or at least mitigating, the problems that you highlighted earlier about where we attach beliefs to identity, where we have a heart, where we these words come up and we decide that person has just signaled that they're wearing a blue jersey, and that's a problem because I'm a red jersey person, and then we have a hard time having a conversation. Do you have any advice for approaching those spaces and not getting so tied up in that?
Yeah, the bad news is it does make it more difficult. It really does. And again, as someone who's studied this for a long time, we used to always talk about the movable middle. That you should, and I know marketing does this too, right? You aim your messaging at those who you think might change their mind, right? You might bring them on side, and that was a big thing in public health, right? You can have the biggest impact if you aim to the movable middle. But the problem is, as everyone knows, we're becoming more polarized, and the camps are becoming more ossified. And in fact, this whole idea of polarization, I think, is more nuanced than often portrayed. I was at a really interesting event at McMaster just a couple weeks ago where this was the topic, and a lot of the scholars were talking about, there's always been a degree of polarization in our lives, but what's happening now is we're framing the other as the enemy more, right? And we're projecting onto the blue shirt, red shirt, all these characteristics, right? You believe when in reality we all have pretty nuanced positions. Like maybe you are a social liberal but an economic conservative, and I actually think that that's not an uncommon position in Canada, right? But you can't hold those positions anymore, right? You're either all on one side, all on another side. So the first bit of advice is to recognize that nuance, right? To not project onto the other all these positions, right? So that's one thing that we can do. The other thing to do is to recognize the degree to which this is often about community. I'm part of this community, and that's why I believe these things. And so we have to engage people in those communities. And we try to do that with an initiative we have, #ScienceUpFirst. It's a social media initiative that we've started. I'm just an advisor on it now, but we try to do exactly that. We partner with those communities, co-create content. So they're creating content that speaks to the values of those individuals. And that's a good segue to the other advice. And I know marketers do this all the time. Companies do this all the time, but still worth saying. We all share values, right? Let's say you're talking about, disagree with someone about GMOs. everyone wants to feed the world. No one wants the world to starve. We all want sustainable agriculture. Talk about that. Talk about that, and then back into, what is the place of GMOs in that solution, as opposed to saying you're wrong about GMOs.
Yeah.
So sort of bypass the misinformation and the contention and go to those shared values. And in the book, I even talk about, this sounds really kind of new agey and and maybe kind of frivolous, but I mean this. Talk about things that we share in common, about music, about sports, about hobbies. We all share, common interests. And there is a little bit of research, and again, hard to study this well, and I'm probably over-interpreting the research because I love the message. But look, maybe we all love, you meet someone who loves Stevie Wonder, and let's talk about Stevie Wonder and then talk about it. And there's a little bit of evidence that suggests that if you do that, you're more likely to have a constructive conversation. Okay, I'm going to say one more thing. We got to get out of our echo chambers. Because other research has shown the more you spend time with the other, the more you spend time with other communities, the less likely you're to stigmatize them, have stereotyped views of them, the more likely you are to tolerate their perspectives, the more likely you are to have those nuanced conversations. That's getting more difficult because of our echo chamber lives, but I do think I try to do that in the documentaries that I've worked on, and I really do think that is important.
Yeah, I think I've had that certainly that's happened to me, where I've been getting into some topic with somebody that's been really interesting and we're both passionate about it, and then they voice something and I'm like, whoa, that's not where I'm at at all. And I think it's to the point you were making, my reaction is seldom to recoil, but more to ask myself how strongly I think I believe what I think I believe. Like, why am I so different? This person's voiced a thing that should be alienating if that's what we led with, but it wasn't. And I find I'm like limbered up a little bit. I'm able to roll with it a little bit.
The taxi driver conversations. You spend the first 25 minutes talking about the sports and argue, having a great conversation about this, and then he puts on his MAGA hat. You're more likely, to, I think, where did that come from? As opposed to, oh my God, this guy in the front seat is the enemy. I don't want to presume any ideological leanings of your audience. I apologize for that that comment, but you get the idea.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes the shorthand. The shorthand kind of gets smacked away, and we're stuck with like complicated, like a person with all their like complicated stuff. The last thing I want to ask you before we close is about the danger of cynicism and the value of skepticism. There's a passage, I think it goes as you write it, is to be open to the wonder but not closed to the facts. Can you explain that crucial fine line?
It is a fine line. I wrote that line for me because I'm getting, and you can't, maybe you work in this space, you can't blame me. I'm getting cynical.
Yeah.
My knee jerk now is that's BS, right? That's cynicism, right? And a really good example of that, I'll give two. The GLP-1s, that have rolled out, Ozempic, et cetera, right? And all the other. My knee jerk, because I've worked in the obesity space for a long time, is it's overhyped, and all the whole section on the hype in the book, right? That's overhyped. It's going to be problematic. It's not going to be, on and on and on. That was my out of the gate. And I bet you I could even find, a media comment about that or something on social media. Look, there's a whole bunch of problems with it. It's very complex, but this is actually a drug that works. Like, it has an impact, and it also has an impact on metabolic outcomes too, and health outcomes. So that's a really good example where I should have been open to the possibility that this is going to make a meaningful difference. I'm not saying there aren't huge social complexities to this and body image issues, on and on and on. But it is a fascinating, that's a good, the other one I think is mindfulness. Out of the gate, I'm like, what do even the term like mindfulness is like a red flag for Caulfield, right? And yes, there's been way too much hype and overpromise and commercialization and, all those things associated with the term mindfulness. But interesting research has emerged. It's much more nuanced, and I shouldn't have been so skeptical. So it's this idea of being open to the wonder of science, of the world, being open-minded, but still deploying those critical thinking skills that are so necessary, right? So, I often say, go along for that scientific ride, right? Go along for the ride. Be open to where this evidence is going to take us. And another bit of advice I think that isn't provided enough is be patient. We all want answers immediately. Some event happens in the world and we want a position to be formed instantaneously, when usually it's complex. Wait for the truth to emerge. You don't get a blue ribbon for forming your opinion before other people. So wait for the nuance to emerge, wait for the evidence to emerge, and enjoy that ride.
Yeah. Well, Timothy, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure, and I love the opportunity to work with the Kobo community, because I love reading so much, and so thank you for everything that you do for the reading community.
We would spend our time doing nothing else. Thank you so much. I have been speaking with Timothy Caulfield, author of The Certainty Illusion, What You Don't Know and Why It Matters. Find it and all of his books at Kobo and Conversation's home on the web, kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. Follow us in your podcast player of choice to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, tell somebody who you're absolutely certain will enjoy it. Kobo and Conversation live at KoboCon 2025 was produced by Jarvin Ching with help from Jacqueline Besley and hosted by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for listening.